The woman Gideon pulled from the flames shouldn't have existed. Not here. Not like this. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her frame broad enough to make grown men look like children, yet her eyes held something he'd never seen in someone so powerful. Absolute terror. When he asked her name, she didn't answer. When he asked where she came from, she turned away. But when the old Apache man appeared at his ranch the next morning, Gideon realized the rescue had been the easy part. The fire had started just after sunset. Gideon spotted the smoke rising from the valley near the edge of Apache territory, a place he'd learned to avoid over his 15 years of solitary ranching. Something about the way the flames climbed made him saddle his horse without thinking. He told himself it was just habit, the instinct of a man who'd seen too much death to ignore it when it came calling again. The cabin was small, barely standing even before the fire took hold. Through the collapsed doorway he could see movement, someone trapped beneath a fallen beam. Gideon didn't hesitate. He never did when it came to this. The heat seared his face as he pushed inside, his eyes watering from the smoke that filled his lungs like poison. What he found stopped him cold. The person pinned beneath the beam wasn't struggling the way most people would. She lay perfectly still, watching the flames creep closer with a resignation that looked almost like acceptance. But it was her size that made Gideon's breath catch. She was massive, not fat, but built with a strength that seemed carved from stone itself. Her arms, though trapped, showed muscles that could probably snap a man's neck without effort. For a moment, Gideon wondered if he'd walked into something he didn't understand, something he shouldn't interfere with. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were dark, deep as canyon shadows, and in them he saw something that decided everything. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of living. That look, that particular brand of resignation, was one he recognized. He'd seen it in his own reflection for years. Gideon grabbed the beam. It didn't move. The woman's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown. But she didn't speak. She just watched him struggle with something that would take 3 normal men to lift. He repositioned his grip, planted his feet, and pulled with everything he had. The wood groaned. His shoulders screamed. Then something inside him, something that had been dead for a long time, roared back to life. The beam shifted. Inches. Then a foot. The woman rolled free just as the roof began collapsing. Gideon didn't remember getting outside. One moment they were inside the inferno, the next they were on the ground 30 feet away, both gasping for air that didn't burn. The cabin folded in on itself with a sound like breaking bones. She sat up slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, Gideon got a full sense of her proportions. She was extraordinary. Her height, her build, everything about her seemed designed to inspire awe or fear. Probably both. Definitely both. He extended his hand to help her stand. She stared at it like he'd offered her a loaded weapon. That's when Gideon noticed her hands. They were covered in old scars, dozens of them, crisscrossing her palms and fingers like a map of violence. These weren't the scars of accidents or work. These were deliberate, methodical. She didn't take his hand. She rose on her own, unsteady but refusing assistance, and when she finally stood to her full height, Gideon had to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. She studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing between the trees like smoke. Gideon stood there, watching the cabin burn down to nothing, wondering what he'd just saved. And more importantly, from what? He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, that look of resignation, those scarred hands, the way she'd rather die than accept help from a stranger. When the sun rose and he heard the sound of horses approaching his ranch, Gideon already knew his life was about to change. He just didn't know how impossible the change would be. The old Apache man who dismounted wore authority like other men wore coats. 3 younger men flanked him, their faces carefully neutral, but their hands never far from their weapons. The old man's eyes found Gideon immediately, reading him the way a hawk reads the ground before diving. He spoke in English, his accent thick but his words precise. "You saved my daughter last night." Not a question, a statement. Gideon nodded slowly. The old man's expression didn't change. "Then you must marry her." Gideon's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The morning sun cast long shadows across his porch, but suddenly everything felt cold. The old Apache man stood perfectly still, waiting for a response to words that made no sense. Behind him, the 3 younger men shifted their weight, hands resting near their weapons with practiced casualness. "Marry her," Just like that. As if saving someone from a fire automatically created a debt that could only be paid with a lifetime commitment. Gideon set the cup down carefully, buying himself seconds to think. His mind raced through possible responses, each one dying before it reached his mouth. This wasn't a request he could laugh off or politely decline. The old man's eyes held the weight of something far more serious than gratitude. "I don't understand," Gideon finally said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My name is Taza. The woman you saved is Nalnish, my daughter, my only child." He paused and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or shame. "Among my people, a life debt must be honored. But there is more than tradition at stake here." Gideon waited, his rancher's instincts telling him to stay silent and let the other man reveal what he needed to say. Taza's next words came slower, heavier. "Nalnish cannot return to our village. She will be harmed if she does. Perhaps killed." He said it without emotion, stating a fact as simple as the color of the sky. "You are the only man who has shown her kindness without fear. You risked your life when you had nothing to gain. This makes you worthy." The logic was insane. Gideon had pulled a stranger from a burning building, something any decent person would do. Now he was being told his reward for basic humanity was to upend his entire existence. Worthy of what exactly? Gideon asked, though he already knew the answer would only make things worse. Of protecting her, of giving her a place where she can exist without persecution. Taza took a step closer, and despite his age, there was nothing frail about the movement. "I am asking you to give my daughter what I cannot. Safety." The word hung between them like smoke. Safety. Such a simple thing to ask for. Such an impossible thing to provide. Gideon thought of his 15 years of solitude, of the careful life he'd built on the edges of civilization, where no one asked questions, and he owed nothing to anyone. He thought of the woman from last night, her massive frame, her scarred hands, the way she'd looked at him like he was another threat instead of her salvation. "Why me?" Gideon asked. "Why not one of your own people?" Taza's expression hardened. "Because my own people are the danger." The statement landed like a physical blow. Gideon had heard stories of tribal conflicts, of people cast out for breaking sacred laws or challenging tradition. But this felt different, more personal, more desperate. What did she do? The question came out before Gideon could stop it. "She was born," Taza said simply. Everything else followed from that. One of the younger men behind Taza shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the tree line as if expecting trouble. Taza noticed the movement, and his voice took on an edge of urgency. "I am not asking you to love her. I am not asking you to want this. I am asking you to honor the life debt and keep her alive." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the porch railing. "This is all I can offer in return. But know this, if you refuse, I will understand, and Nalnish will be dead within the week." Gideon stared at the pouch, his mind reeling. Taza had just handed him an impossible choice wrapped in a death sentence. Refuse, and a woman dies because he chose his comfortable solitude. Accept, and tie himself forever to someone he didn't know. Didn't understand, and frankly wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "I need time to think," Gideon said. Taza nodded slowly. "You have until sunset. After that, we must move her regardless of your answer." He turned to leave, then paused. "She is at the creek beyond your eastern pasture. She refused to come closer to your home. I suggest you speak with her before you decide." The four men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Gideon alone on his porch with a leather pouch and a decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't open the pouch. He already knew no amount of money or goods could balance this equation. Instead, he stood there as the sun climbed higher, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Yesterday he'd saved a life. Today that same act might cost him his freedom. The creek was a 20-minute walk through tall grass that hadn't been cut in years. Gideon found himself moving toward it before he'd consciously decided to go, as if his body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He needed to see her again, needed to understand what Taza was really asking him to protect. What he found at the creek would change everything he thought he knew about impossible choices. She sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, her back to him, but Gideon knew she'd heard him approach. Her posture had shifted, shoulders tensing, head tilting slightly to track his footsteps through the grass. She didn't turn around. In daylight, away from fire and smoke, Naalnish looked even more imposing. Her height wasn't the result of illness or deformity, it was simply who she was, built on a scale that nature rarely attempted. Her dark hair hung past her shoulders, and even sitting, she matched Gideon's standing height. He stopped 10 feet away, giving her space. "Your father came to my ranch this morning." No response. She continued staring at the creek as if he hadn't spoken. Gideon tried again. "He said you can't go home. Said they'll hurt you." This time her shoulders moved, a small shrug that somehow conveyed volumes of resignation. When she finally spoke, her voice was deeper than most women's, but clear and steady. "He should have let me burn." The words hit Gideon harder than he expected. He'd heard despair before, recognized it in the mirror often enough. But this was different. This was someone who'd moved past despair into acceptance of their own worthlessness. "I don't believe that," Gideon said. She turned then, those dark eyes finding his with an intensity that made him want to step back. "You don't know anything about me, about what I am. I know you didn't start that fire yourself. Someone said it. Someone wanted you dead." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, that he'd figured it out so quickly. "Does it matter? One way or another, I was always going to end this way." Gideon moved closer, slowly, the way he'd approach a wounded animal. "Your father asked me to marry you, to keep you safe." Naalnish laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held no humor. "Of course he did. The great Taza, trying to solve his embarrassment by giving me to the first white man who showed basic decency." She stood abruptly, rising to her full height, and Gideon had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "Do you know what I am to my people? A curse. A punishment from the spirits for some crime my mother must have committed." "That's true," she cut him off. "I was born too large, too strong, too different. When I was young, they tried to fix me. Medicine men, shamans, healers who promised they could make me normal." She held up her scarred hands. "These are from the ceremonies, the bindings, the attempts to stop my bones from growing wrong." Gideon stared at those scars with new understanding. Someone had deliberately hurt this woman, repeatedly, trying to change something that couldn't be changed. "When nothing worked," Naalnish continued, her voice flat, "they decided I was possessed. Dangerous. Something that needed to be isolated before I corrupted others." She took a step toward him, and despite everything, Gideon's instincts screamed at him to retreat. "So they built me that cabin. Sent food once a week, pretended I didn't exist. And I let them because at least isolation was better than their ceremonies. Until someone decided isolation wasn't enough," Gideon said quietly. She nodded. "3 nights ago I heard them outside my cabin, young warriors, arguing about whether killing me would bring honor or shame to the tribe." Her jaw tightened. "They compromised, set the fire, and left. If I died, it was the spirit's will. If I survived, perhaps the flames would purify me." The casual cruelty of it made Gideon's stomach turn. These weren't enemies or strangers. These were her own people, her own community, deciding her life was worth less than their superstitions. "Your father is trying to protect you," Gideon said. "My father is trying to save face," Naalnish corrected. "He's a leader. He can't openly defy the tribe's judgment without losing his authority. But he also can't let his daughter be murdered without trying something." She looked at Gideon with eyes that had seen too much rejection. "So he found you, a white rancher with no ties to our world, someone who could take me off his hands and ease his conscience." Gideon wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He didn't know Taza well enough to judge the man's motivations. All he knew was that right now, in this moment, the woman in front of him needed help whether she wanted to admit it or not. "What do you want?" he asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, confusion crossing her face as if no one had ever asked her that before. "I want," she started, then stopped, tried again. "I don't know. I've spent so long trying to survive that I forgot there might be other options." Before Gideon could respond, the sound of horses cut through the morning air, multiple riders moving fast, coming from the direction of Apache territory. Naalnish's entire body went rigid. "They found me faster than I thought." "Who?" Gideon asked, though dread was already pooling in his gut. She looked at him with something close to pity. "The ones who want to finish what the fire started." 5 riders emerged from the tree line, moving with the confidence of men who knew they outnumbered their target. They weren't dressed for ceremony or diplomacy. These were hunters, and Naalnish was their prey. Gideon stepped between her and the approaching horses, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, though he wore no weapon. It was a stupid, reflexive gesture that wouldn't stop anything, but his body moved before his mind could talk him out of it. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet away. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted with disgust. His eyes locked onto Nalnish with the kind of hatred that came from deep conviction. "Step aside, white man," he said in heavily accented English. "This is not your concern." "She's on my land," Gideon replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "That makes it my concern." The young warrior's jaw tightened. He said something in his own language, sharp and dismissive. Behind Gideon, Nalnish translated quietly. "He says I poisoned his brother, made him sick with my presence." "Did you?" Gideon asked, not taking his eyes off the riders. "I've never spoken to his brother, never been near him." Her voice held exhaustion, as if she'd defended herself from these accusations too many times. "But his brother caught fever last winter. Someone had to be blamed." The lead warrior spoke again, this time directing his words at Nalnish. His tone carried the weight of judgment, of righteousness. She didn't translate, but Gideon could hear the venom in every syllable. "Leave," Gideon said, cutting through the warrior's speech. "Now." The young man's eyes narrowed. "You would protect a demon? You would stand against us for something that should have died years ago?" Something in Gideon's chest went cold and hard. He'd heard that tone before, the absolute certainty that another human being was less than human. He'd heard it from men who justified every cruelty, every injustice, by simply deciding their victim wasn't worth basic decency. "I'm standing against 5 men who rode onto my property to threaten a woman," Gideon said. "Now get off my land before I make you." It was an empty threat and everyone knew it. 5 armed warriors against 1 unarmed rancher. The math was brutal and simple. The lead warrior smiled, recognizing Gideon's bluff. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of his authority. The other 4 followed suit, fanning out in a loose semicircle. "You made a mistake, white man," the warrior said, drawing a long knife from his belt. "Taza may have fooled you with his stories, but she is not worth dying for." Gideon's mind raced through possibilities. He was fast, but not fast enough to outrun 5 men. Strong, but not strong enough to fight them all. His ranch house was too far to reach, and even if he made it, his rifle was locked in a cabinet that would take precious seconds to open. He was out of options and out of time. Then Nalnish moved. She didn't step forward aggressively or make any threatening gesture. She simply rose to her full height and let the warriors see her completely. All 7 feet of her, every inch of muscle and bone that made her different. That made her terrifying. The effect was immediate. The warriors stopped advancing. 2 of them actually took a step back. Nalnish spoke in her own language, her voice carrying across the creek with absolute authority. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood the message. She was challenging them directly, removing Gideon from the equation. The lead warrior's face went pale, then red with rage. He shouted something back, but his voice cracked slightly. "Fear," Gideon realized. These men were afraid of her. "What did you say?" Gideon asked quietly. "I told them if they want to kill me, they should try," Nalnish replied. "But I won't go quietly. I won't burn or run or make it easy." She took a step forward, and the warriors retreated another step. "I told them whoever comes for me should make peace with their families first, because they won't be going home." It was a bluff. It had to be. But watching the warriors' faces, Gideon wasn't entirely sure. There was something in Nalnish's stance, in the way she carried herself, that suggested she meant every word. The lead warrior was caught between his hatred and his fear. Gideon could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Was killing this woman worth risking his own life? Was his brother's fever worth becoming another body? The standoff stretched for seconds that felt like hours. Then hoofbeats shattered the tension. Taza appeared from the north, riding hard with a dozen warriors behind him. He positioned himself between his daughter and the young warriors, his face a mask of controlled fury. The confrontation that followed was entirely in their language, but Gideon didn't need translation. Taza was exercising his authority as a leader, and the young warriors were being forced to back down. But the looks they shot at Nalnish before mounting their horses promised this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the 5 riders disappeared into the trees, Taza turned to Gideon. "You have until sunset to decide. After that, I cannot protect her. Not even from my own people." He rode off without another word, leaving Gideon alone with Nalnish and a decision that had just become infinitely more complicated, because now he understood something crucial. This wasn't just about marriage or tradition or honor. This was about survival, and time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Silence settled over the creek like dust after a storm. Nalnish sat back down on her rock, but her hands were shaking. Small tremors that she tried to hide by gripping her knees, but Gideon saw them anyway. The woman who'd just stared down 5 armed warriors was terrified. "You weren't bluffing," Gideon said, sitting on a fallen log nearby. "Were you?" Nalnish didn't answer immediately. She stared at her scarred palms as if reading something written there in old pain. 3 years ago, a man from the village decided to test whether I was truly cursed. He came to my cabin at night with a knife. Gideon waited, sensing this story needed to be told at its own pace. He thought because I was a woman, I would be easy to overpower. He was wrong. She looked up, meeting Gideon's eyes. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. But when someone my size fights back, even in defense, the results are permanent." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The fear in the warrior's eyes, the way they'd retreated when she stood. This wasn't superstition or rumor. These men knew, firsthand or through stories, that Nalnish was dangerous when cornered. "What happened after?" Gideon asked. Taza covered it up, said the man fell from his horse and broke his neck. Most people believed it because the alternative was admitting one of their warriors had tried to attack a helpless woman and lost. Her voice hardened. But some knew the truth, and those who knew made sure everyone else understood that touching me meant risking death. Gideon processed this carefully. "So they're afraid of you, but they still want you dead." "Fear and hatred often walk together," Nalnish said quietly. "They fear what I might do. They hate that I exist at all. The fire was their way of solving both problems without risking direct confrontation." A bird called from somewhere in the trees, its song incongruously cheerful against the weight of their conversation. Gideon watched the creek water flow past, thinking about choices and consequences. "If I say no," he started, then paused, making sure he wanted to ask this question. "If I refuse your father's proposal, where will you go?" Nalnish considered the question for a long moment. "There's a trading post 3 days north, run by a French trapper who doesn't care much about local politics. I could try to work there, assuming he doesn't shoot me on sight for being Apache. And if he does?" She shrugged. "Then I keep moving until I find somewhere that will tolerate me, or until I can't move anymore." The casual acceptance of her own probable death struck Gideon harder than it should. This woman had been living with a death sentence her entire life. The fire, the warriors, the isolation. These were just the latest attempts in a long campaign to erase her existence. "Why did you refuse to come near my ranch house?" Gideon asked, changing direction. "Your father said you wouldn't get any closer." For the first time, something close to embarrassment crossed Nalnish's face. "Because I didn't want you to feel trapped. You saved my life. I didn't want you to wake up and find me on your property like some obligation you couldn't escape." The consideration in that gesture, the awareness of how her presence might affect him, revealed more about her character than anything else she'd said. Despite everything she'd endured, she still thought about other people's comfort before her own. Gideon stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "Come back to the house." Nalnish looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because if we're going to have this conversation, we should do it properly. And because you haven't eaten since yesterday, and I'm not letting you starve on my land while I figure out what to do." She didn't move. "I'm not asking you to save me again." "I know," Gideon said. "I'm not asking your permission." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or the first hint of hope. She stood slowly, and together they walked back through the tall grass toward his ranch house. They were halfway there when Gideon heard the sound that changed everything. A woman's scream, high and desperate, coming from the direction of his barn. He broke into a run, Nalnish keeping pace beside him despite her size. They rounded the corner of the house and stopped dead. A wagon had overturned near the barn entrance. A woman knelt beside it, trying desperately to lift one side. Underneath, barely visible, was a small child. "Help!" the woman shouted when she saw them. "My son is trapped! Please, the wheel is crushing him!" Gideon sprinted forward, his mind already calculating angles and leverage points. The wagon was heavy, built for hauling supplies, and the wheel had the child pinned at the chest. The boy wasn't moving. Gideon grabbed the wagon's frame and pulled. It barely shifted. The woman was crying now, begging, her hands bleeding from trying to claw at the wooden wheel. "It's too heavy," Gideon gasped, pulling harder. His muscles screamed, but the wagon wouldn't budge. The boy's face was turning blue. Then Nalnish was there. She positioned herself beside Gideon, wrapped her hands around the wagon's frame, and lifted. The wagon rose. Slowly at first, then steadily, as if it weighed nothing at all. The woman dragged her son free, cradling him as he gasped for air. Nalnish held the wagon up until Gideon helped prop it with a beam. Then she stepped back, breathing hard but steady. The woman looked up at Nalnish, her face wet with tears and gratitude. Then her eyes widened as she truly saw who had saved her child. Her expression shifted from gratitude to recognition, to something that looked horribly like fear. "You're the giant," she whispered, pulling her son closer. "The cursed one." And Gideon realized their decision had just been made for them in the worst possible way. The woman gathered her son and scrambled backward, putting distance between herself and Nalnish, as if proximity alone could cause harm. The boy was coughing, breathing again, alive because of the person his mother now looked at with naked terror. "Thank you," the woman managed to say, but the words came out strangled, forced. Her eyes never left Nalnish, tracking her like a predator. Nalnish stood perfectly still, her face carefully blank. Gideon recognized that expression now. It was the same one she'd worn in the burning cabin. Resignation, the knowledge that no good deed would ever be enough to overcome what she was. "Your son needs water," Gideon said, breaking the tension. "And you should check for broken ribs. Come inside." The woman's eyes snapped to him, and he saw the calculation happening. Accept help from the man who harbored a demon, or refuse and risk her child's health? "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I can't." She climbed onto the overturned wagon seat, pulling her son onto her lap, and urged the remaining horse forward. The animal struggled against the unbalanced weight, but eventually the wagon lurched away, leaving deep ruts in the dirt. Gideon watched them go, anger building in his chest. That boy was alive because of Nalnish. The mother knew it, and still she fled as if staying would doom them both. "This is why I stayed at the creek," Nalnish said quietly. She hadn't moved from where she'd set down the wagon. "People see me, and all they can think about is what I might do, not what I actually did." Before Gideon could respond, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman's wagon was heading south, directly toward the nearest settlement, a cluster of homesteads and a small trading post about 6 miles away. She would talk. Of course she would. She'd tell everyone about the giant Apache woman staying at Gideon Pratt's ranch. She'd describe how Nalnish had lifted that wagon with impossible strength, and because fear made people stupid, they'd forget the part about saving a child and remember only that something unnatural lived nearby. "We need to leave," Nalnish said, reading his expression. "Now, before that woman brings back half the territory." "Where would you go?" Gideon asked. She shook her head. "Not we. Me. You've done more than enough. I won't let you lose your home because of my existence." The word choice struck him. Not because of me, but because of my existence. As if her mere presence in the world was the problem, not the fear and hatred of everyone around her. Gideon looked at his ranch house, at the land he'd carved from wilderness through 15 years of backbreaking work. He thought about the isolation he'd chosen, the walls he'd built to keep the world at a safe distance. He'd convinced himself that solitude was freedom. But watching Nalnish prepare to walk away into certain death, he realized he'd been lying to himself for years. Isolation wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of prison. "The sun's about halfway to setting," Gideon said, checking its position. "Your father gave me until sunset to decide." He turned to face her fully. "I'm deciding now." Nalnish's expression flickered, hope and fear warring across her features. "Don't make this choice because you feel sorry for me." "I'm not," Gideon said, and realized it was true. "I'm making it because those warriors are going to come back, and when they do, they'll have numbers. And because that woman is spreading stories right now that will turn every homesteader within 50 miles into your enemy." He took a step closer. "I'm making it because if I let you walk away, you'll be dead within 3 days, and I'll have to live knowing I could have stopped it." "You don't owe me anything," she said, but her voice shook slightly. "No," Gideon agreed, "but maybe I owe myself something. Maybe I'm tired of watching people suffer because it's easier than standing up." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither fully understood yet. Nalnish studied him for a long moment. You understand what you're agreeing to? This isn't a temporary arrangement. Among my people, marriage is binding, forever. There's no changing your mind in a year when you realize what a mistake this was. I understand. You'll be tied to someone everyone fears. Your neighbors will avoid you. They'll whisper. Some might even try to drive you out. Her voice hardened. You'll lose everything you've built here. Then we'll build somewhere else, Gideon said simply. She blinked, surprised. We? You think I'm marrying you just to leave you on your own? Despite everything, Gideon almost smiled. That defeats the whole purpose. Nalnish opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I don't understand you. That makes two of us, Gideon admitted. But we've got the rest of our lives to figure it out. The sound of horses approaching cut off whatever she might have said next. Gideon turned to see Taza riding toward them alone, his weathered face unreadable in the afternoon light. The old man dismounted slowly, his eyes moving between Gideon and Nalnish, reading the space between them like tracks in dirt. You have made your choice, Taza said. Not a question. I have, Gideon confirmed. Taza nodded once, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in leather. Then we must do this now, before the settlers come, before my warriors return. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time, Gideon saw genuine pain in the old man's eyes. I am sorry it had to be this way. Nalnish's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Taza unwrapped the bundle, revealing what looked like ceremonial items. Nothing elaborate, just simple objects that carried the weight of tradition. A binding requires a witness and an exchange of promises, Taza said. I will serve as witness. The promises you must make yourselves. Gideon looked at Nalnish, at this woman he barely knew, who he was about to bind himself to for life. She looked back at him with eyes that held a question she couldn't quite voice. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer, Gideon heard the sound of many horses. Time had run out. The approaching horses grew louder, at least a dozen riders, maybe more. Taza heard them too. His face remained calm, but his movements became more urgent as he arranged the ceremonial items on a flat rock. We don't have time for the full ritual, Taza said. We'll do the binding. That's all that matters legally and spiritually. Gideon glanced toward the sound of hoofbeats. How long? 5 minutes, maybe less. Taza positioned himself so he could see both the path and his daughter. Stand facing each other. Gideon and Nalnish moved to comply. She stood a full head taller than him, forcing Gideon to tilt his chin up to maintain eye contact. In any other circumstance, the height difference would have been comical. Now, it just felt surreal. In my culture, Taza began, speaking quickly, marriage is about protection and partnership, not love, not romance. Those may come later, or they may not. What matters is the commitment to stand together against the world. He looked at Gideon. Do you understand this? I do. Taza turned to his daughter. Nalnish, this man offers you his name, his home, and his protection. Do you accept? She hesitated, her eyes searching Gideon's face as if trying to find the lie, the trick, the inevitable betrayal. She'd been hurt too many times to trust easily. The horses were close enough now that Gideon could hear individual voices shouting to each other. We're running out of time, Taza said softly. Nalnish took a breath. I accept. Gideon Pratt, Taza continued. This woman offers you her loyalty, her labor, and her presence in your life until death. Do you accept? The phrasing was deliberately transactional, stripping away any pretense of romance. This was a contract, not a love story. Gideon appreciated the honesty. I accept. Taza picked up a length of woven cord from his ceremonial items. Among my people, we bind the hands to symbolize the binding of lives, but we don't have time for that. Instead, he took Gideon's right hand and placed it against Nalnish's left palm. Her hand was massive compared to his, scarred and calloused from years of isolation and hard living. But her grip, when she closed her fingers around his, was surprisingly gentle. In the eyes of the spirits, in the eyes of the earth, in the eyes of those who witness, Taza said, his voice carrying ritual weight despite the rushed circumstances. You are now bound. What was two is now one. This cannot be undone. He wrapped the cord around their joined hands once, symbolic rather than functional, then removed it. It's done, Taza said. She is now your responsibility, your burden, your family. The words should have felt heavy, oppressive. Instead, Gideon felt something unexpected, relief, like he'd finally made a decision that mattered, after years of making none at all. Nalnish pulled her hand back slowly, staring at her palm as if expecting to see some visible change. When she looked up at Gideon, her expression was unreadable. The riders burst into view, not Apache warriors this time, but settlers. Rough men from the homesteads, led by a thick-necked farmer Gideon recognized from the trading post. They carried rifles, pitchforks, improvised weapons. Behind them, looking pale and frightened, was the woman whose son Nalnish had saved. "There!" someone shouted, pointing at Nalnish. "That's the one Martha described." The mob pulled their horses to a stop, forming a loose semicircle around Gideon's property. The farmer who'd led them raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone yet, but the threat was clear. "Pratt," he called out, "step away from that thing. We're here to handle this before someone gets hurt." Taza moved to stand beside his daughter, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The old man looked small next to Nalnish, but his presence carried authority that made several of the settlers shift nervously. Gideon stepped forward, positioning himself between the mob and he stumbled mentally over the word, his wife. "You're on my land," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the distance. "And you're threatening my family." The word family hung in the air like a gunshot. Several settlers exchanged confused glances. "Your family?" The farmer's face twisted with disgust. "That's no family. That's a monster. Martha said it lifted a wagon like it was nothing. That ain't natural. That ain't human. That woman saved Martha's son from dying," Gideon shot back. "Where's the monster in that?" "Don't matter what it did," another settler yelled. "It shouldn't exist. The Apache know it. That's why they tried to burn it." The logic was circular and vicious, fed by fear and the human need to destroy what they didn't understand. Gideon had seen this before, in different contexts, different targets. The pattern was always the same. "Her name is Nalnish," Gideon said, emphasizing the word her, "and as of 5 minutes ago, she's my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the shock rippling through the crowd. "You married it?" The farmer's voice rose in disbelief. "Are you insane? You brought a curse onto your own head?" "I made a choice," Gideon replied. "Same choice I'm making now. You want to hurt my wife, you go through me first." The farmer's face flushed red. He raised his rifle fully now, pointing it directly at Gideon's chest. "Then maybe we go through you." Taza's hand tightened on his knife. Nalnish took a step forward, placing herself partially in front of Gideon, protecting him despite being the one everyone wanted dead. The tension stretched like wire about to snap. Then a new voice cut through the standoff. Cold and authoritative. "Lower your weapons. Now." Everyone turned to see a man on horseback approaching from the east. He wore a badge pinned to his vest. Territorial marshal, the kind of authority that transcended local feuds and mob justice. The marshal surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, taking in the armed settlers, the Apache elder, the unusually tall woman, and Gideon standing between all of them. "Someone want to explain," the marshal said slowly. "Why I just rode into what looks like a lynching." The marshal dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd defused too many powder kegs to rush. He was older than Gideon expected, maybe 60, with gray threading through his dark beard and eyes that had seen every variation of human stupidity. "Marshal Keene," he introduced himself, though he didn't offer his hand. "Someone want to start talking before I arrest all of you for disturbing the peace?" The farmer with the rifle lowered it slightly, but his jaw remained set. "This man harbors a dangerous creature, Marshal. We got a right to protect our families." "That so?" Keene's eyes moved to Nalnish, studying her without the fear or disgust the settlers showed. "Just clinical assessment." "You kill anyone, ma'am?" Nalnish hesitated, then spoke clearly. "One man, 3 years ago. He came to kill me first. Self-defense. Witnesses?" "Her father witnessed the aftermath," Gideon interjected. "Taza here. He's a respected leader among the Apache." Keene looked at Taza, who nodded once. The marshal seemed to consider this, then turned back to the settlers. "Self-defense ain't murder. That's law, not opinion." He gestured at the mob. "What I see here is a dozen armed men threatening a woman on private property. That's not protection. That's a crime." "But she's not natural," another settler shouted. "Look at her." "Being tall isn't illegal," Keene said flatly. "Being different isn't illegal. Hell, Being Apache isn't even illegal, though some of you act like it should be. His voice hardened. What is illegal is forming a lynch mob. So unless someone can give me actual evidence of an actual crime, you boys are going home. Now. The farmer's face flushed red. You're just going to let this stand? Let Pratt keep that thing on his land? That thing, Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet, is my wife. Show some respect, or get off my property. Several settlers actually flinched at the word wife. Martha, the woman whose son had been saved, looked like she might be sick. Marshal Keene's eyebrows rose slightly. Your wife, that legal? Witnessed and binding, Taza confirmed. 5 minutes ago. Apache ceremony, but recognized by territorial law regarding indigenous marriages. Keene nodded slowly. Then it's settled. These folks are married. What they do on their own land is their business. He fixed the settlers with a hard stare. Anyone got a problem with that, you take it up with a judge, not with rifles and pitchforks. The mob shifted uncertainly, their righteous anger deflating under the weight of actual authority. Without the fuel of mob mentality, they were just frightened neighbors who'd let fear override reason. This isn't over, the farmer muttered, but he was already turning his horse around. Yeah, it is, Keene replied. And if I hear about anyone bothering the Pratts, I'll be back, and I won't be polite. The settlers dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks over their shoulders but lacking the courage to defy a territorial marshal. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only dust and the memory of how close everything had come to violence. Keene watched them go, then turned to Gideon. You know what you've done? Made a choice, Gideon said. Made yourself an outcast, Keene corrected. Those settlers won't forget, won't forgive. You'll be welcome nowhere within 50 miles. Then we'll go somewhere else. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then surprised Gideon by almost smiling. Stubborn. Good. You'll need it. He looked at Nalnish. You got lucky finding this one, ma'am. Most men would have let the mob have you just to save their own skin. I know, Nalnish said quietly. Keene mounted his horse, preparing to leave. Then he paused. There's territory opening up further west, past the mineral claims. Good land, plenty of water, far enough from settlements that folks won't bother you much. He adjusted his reins. Just a suggestion, from someone who's seen too many good people destroyed by bad neighbors. With that, he rode off, leaving Gideon, Nalnish, and Taza alone in the settling dust. Taza approached his daughter, his weathered face showing emotions he'd kept carefully hidden until now. I chose this man, he said, speaking to her in English so Gideon would understand, because 15 years ago, he lost his wife and child to sickness. He knows grief. He knows isolation. The old man's voice roughened. And because when I watched him from the ridge last night, I saw him pull you from that fire without hesitation, without fear, without calculating what it would cost him. Gideon stiffened. You were watching? I needed to know what kind of man you were before I asked this of you. Taza looked between them. Some men are brave only when it benefits them. You are brave even when it destroys you. That is the kind of man who could protect my daughter. He reached out and touched Nalnish's scarred hand gently. I failed you. Let them hurt you. Let them make you believe you were less than human. His voice broke slightly. This is my way of making it right. Giving you to someone who will see you as I should have, as worthy of protection, of life, of dignity. Nalnish's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she squeezed her father's hand once, a gesture that said more than words could. Taza mounted his horse. I will not see you again. It would endanger you both if I did. But know this, you are no longer alone. Either of you. He rode away without looking back, leaving Gideon and Nalnish standing in front of the ranch house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. They were married. They were outcasts. They were bound together by impossible circumstances and a ceremony performed under threat of death. And somehow, against all logic, Gideon felt more free than he had in 15 years. The house felt different with another person inside. Gideon had lived alone for so long that even the sound of someone else breathing in the next room seemed foreign. He stood at the window, watching the last light fade from the sky, aware of Nalnish sitting at his table behind him. She hadn't spoken since they'd come inside, just sat there, hands folded in her lap, waiting for something. Instructions maybe, or rejection, once the reality of what he'd agreed to fully sank in. We should leave, Gideon said, breaking the silence. Head west like the marshal suggested. Start fresh somewhere people don't know our story. When? Her voice was steady, practical. 3 days. Time enough to pack what matters, sell what doesn't. He turned to face her. I'm not sentimental about this place. It was just somewhere to hide. Nalnish looked around the sparse room. Simple furniture, bare walls, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. Just existed. 15 years in one place and you call it hiding? What would you call it? She considered the question carefully. Waiting, maybe. For something worth coming back to life for. The observation was too accurate, too close to truths Gideon had avoided examining. He'd told himself he chose solitude, that he preferred isolation. But really, he'd just been frozen in place, unable to move forward or back, stuck in the moment his family died. What about you? Gideon asked. What were you doing in that cabin all those years? The same thing, Nalnish admitted. Waiting to die, just taking longer than expected. They sat with that honesty for a moment. Two people who'd given up on living suddenly forced to figure out how to do it together. I don't know how to be married, Gideon said finally. Especially like this. No courtship, no time to know each other. Nothing but circumstances forcing us together. I don't know how to be anything except alone, Nalnish replied. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to like me. Just don't regret this. Not out loud, at least. The vulnerability in that request struck Gideon hard. She expected rejection, even from the man who'd married her to save her life. Come here, he said. She rose slowly, uncertainty in every movement, and crossed the room. Standing this close, the height difference was even more pronounced. Gideon had to crane his neck back to meet her eyes. I'm going to tell you something, Gideon said, and I need you to believe it, because I won't repeat it. He held her gaze. I don't regret this. Not the marriage, not the choice, none of it. What I regret is that the world made this necessary. That people treated you so badly that death looked preferable to living. Nalnish's throat worked as she swallowed hard. You don't know me well enough to mean that. I know enough. I know you'd rather die than accept help. But you helped me anyway when those warriors came. I know you lifted that wagon to save a child who'd never thank you. I know you've survived years of treatment that would have broken most people. He reached up and took her scarred hand. That's enough to know you're worth protecting. For the first time since he'd met her, Nalnish's carefully controlled expression cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness but of something deeper. Relief, maybe, or recognition that someone finally saw her as human. I'll try not to be a burden, she whispered. You'll fail, Gideon said bluntly, because everyone's a burden sometimes. That's what marriage is, agreeing to carry each other when needed. He squeezed her hand gently. But I'll try not to be one either, and we'll both fail at that too, and we'll figure it out anyway. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. That's a terrible foundation for a marriage. Better than most get, Gideon replied. Over the next 3 days, they prepared to leave. Gideon sold his livestock to a neighboring rancher, who needed them more than answers about why. They packed only what 2 horses could carry. Tools, supplies, and very little else. The land itself Gideon simply abandoned. It wasn't worth the trouble of selling, and whoever wanted it badly enough could claim it. On the morning of their departure, Nalnish stood outside the ranch house one last time, looking at the place that had been her husband's home for 15 years. Any regrets? She asked. Gideon tightened the straps on his horse's saddle. Only that I didn't leave sooner. They rode west together as the sun climbed higher, 2 outcasts heading toward territory where maybe, possibly, they could build something that resembled a life. They didn't speak much during the journey, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who understood that words weren't always necessary. A week into their travel, they found the land the marshal had mentioned, a valley with good water, sheltered from harsh winds, far enough from settlements that curious eyes wouldn't find them. They built a small cabin together, Nalnish's strength making the work go faster than Gideon ever could have managed alone. Months passed, then a year. The neighbors they eventually acquired were sparse and minded their own business, which suited both of them fine. Nalnish learned that not everyone feared her, and Gideon learned that isolation had never been the freedom he'd convinced himself it was. They never spoke of love. That wasn't what they'd agreed to, but they built something arguably more valuable: partnership, respect, and the knowledge that neither of them had to face the world alone anymore. Gideon had saved her from fire. She'd saved him from a different kind of burning, the slow consumption of living without purpose. The impossible request had led to an impossible life. But sometimes, Gideon thought as he watched Nelnish work in their garden one spring morning, impossible was exactly what both of them had needed all along. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and choices reshape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. $10,000 for one night with your giant Apache wife. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fresh wound. Every person on that dusty street stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. Because when a man in a $1,000 suit stands in the middle of town holding a bag of money with a dollar sign painted on it, making an offer like that, one of two things happens. Either blood spills in the next 30 seconds, or something far worse unfolds. What nobody understood yet was that Silas Kemper had spent 3 years learning a different language than violence, and what Cornelius Blackwell was about to discover would cost him more than money ever could buy back. The sun beat down on the town's main street, with the kind of heat that made men's shirts stick to their backs and turned the ground into something that felt like walking on the surface of a stove. Silas had come into town that morning for supplies, nothing more. Flour, salt, ammunition for hunting, maybe some fabric Nahimana had mentioned needing for a new shirt. Simple errands that should have taken an hour, and sent them back to their ranch before the worst heat settled in. Nahimana walked beside him the way she always did, not behind him like some of the townspeople expected, not ahead of him like she was trying to prove something. Beside him, equal. Her presence turned heads not because she was Apache, though that was reason enough in a place where most people had never spoken to a native person in their lives. Heads turned because Nahimana stood taller than most men in town, with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of physical work that would break lesser people. Her braids reached past her waist, woven with small turquoise stones that caught the light when she moved. She wore traditional clothing that showed her heritage with pride, never attempting to hide who she was or where she came from. Silas had learned early in their marriage that the stairs never bothered her. What bothered her was disrespect. There was a difference between curiosity and contempt, and Nahimana could spot contempt from 100 yards away. They had just stepped out of the general store when Cornelius Blackwell made his entrance. He arrived in a carriage that cost more than most families in town would see in 5 years of hard labor. The door opened, and he stepped down onto the street in his fine black suit, polished shoes that had never seen a day of real work, and a smile that suggested he believed the entire world existed for his entertainment. Silas recognized the type immediately. Rich men came through frontier towns regularly, looking to buy land, exploit resources, or simply amuse themselves with the locals before returning to their comfortable lives back east. They rarely stayed long, and Silas had learned the best strategy was to simply avoid them until they left. But Blackwell had spotted them. More specifically, he had spotted Nahimana. He walked directly toward them with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. 2 men in slightly less expensive suits followed behind him, carrying themselves like guards or hired muscle. When Blackwell got within 10 feet, he stopped and removed his hat, with an exaggerated flourish that might have been meant as respectful, but came across as mocking. "My goodness," he said, his voice carrying across the street loud enough for everyone to hear. "You must be the famous couple I've been hearing about. The rancher who married the savage." The word landed like a slap. Nahimana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. Silas felt his own muscles tense, but he forced himself to remain calm. Men like Blackwell wanted a reaction. They fed on it. "We're just here for supplies," Silas said evenly. "We'll be on our way." "Oh, but I haven't made my offer yet." Blackwell reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather bag. He opened it to reveal stacks of crisp bills. $10,000. More money than you'll see in your entire life working that pathetic ranch of yours. He held the bag out toward Silas, his smile widening. "All I want is one night with your wife." The street went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Silas felt every eye in town turn toward them, waiting to see what would happen next. His hand moved slowly toward his side, fingers brushing against something in his pocket. And that's when Nahimana laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a genuine, amused laugh that seemed to confuse Blackwell more than any threat could have. She looked at Silas with an expression that said she had dealt with men like this her entire life. and they had always underestimated what that mistake would cost them. But before she could speak, Silas's hand closed around whatever he had been reaching for in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone watching could see exactly what came next, because what happened in the following minutes would determine whether they could ever show their faces in this town again, or whether Cornelius Blackwell would be the one who needed to leave and never come back. Silas pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket. Not a weapon, not a knife, just a small bag that looked like it had seen years of use. The kind of thing a man might carry personal items in. He held it up so Blackwell could see it clearly, then opened it and poured the contents into his palm. Coins, maybe 30 or 40 of them. Silver pieces mixed with copper, the kind of money a working man accumulated slowly over months of hard labor. The total value probably added up to less than $50. Silas held his hand out flat, letting the coins catch the sunlight. "This is everything I had when I asked Nahimana to marry me," he said quietly. $43.16. I offered it to her father, knowing it wasn't nearly enough by any standard. Knowing that in her tribe, a man was expected to bring horses, weapons, valuable goods to prove he could provide for a wife. The crowd had grown larger. People were coming out of buildings now, sensing something significant was happening. Blackwell's smug expression had shifted slightly, though he was clearly trying to maintain his superior attitude. Silas continued, his voice steady and calm. "Her father looked at those coins for a long time. Then he looked at me, and he asked me one question. He asked if I knew what those coins meant in his culture, if I understood that by offering money, I was treating his daughter like property that could be purchased." Nahimana stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes suggested she knew exactly where this was going. She had heard this story before, but hearing it told publicly was different. "I told him I didn't know," Silas said. "I told him I was ignorant of his customs, that I'd grown up in a world where everything had a price attached to it, and I was ashamed to realize I had insulted him and his daughter both. I asked him to teach me the right way, the respectful way." Silas closed his hand around the coins, then looked directly at Blackwell. "He said there was no bride price, that his daughter was not for sale at any amount, that if she chose to marry me, it would be because she saw something in me worth building a life with, not because I could afford her." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Blackwell's face had started to redden, though whether from anger or embarrassment was hard to tell. "So I kept these coins," Silas said, "as a reminder that the most valuable thing in my life was given to me freely, out of choice and respect, not because I had enough money to purchase it." He poured the coins back into the pouch and returned it to his pocket. Then he looked at Blackwell's bag of money with something that might have been pity. "You can't buy her for $10,000, Silas said. "You can't buy her for $1 million, because she's not for sale. She never was. She chose me, and that choice is worth more than anything you could ever offer." The silence that followed was absolute. People who had been watching with morbid curiosity were now watching with something closer to respect. Blackwell's two men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond to a situation that involved no violence, but somehow felt more dangerous than any gunfight. Blackwell's face had gone from red to almost purple. His hand tightened on the money bag until his knuckles turned white. Men like him were not accustomed to being lectured by people they considered beneath them. They were not used to being made to look foolish in front of crowds, and they especially did not appreciate being given moral lessons by ranchers who lived in modest homes and worked with their hands. "You think you're clever," Blackwell said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this little speech makes you better than me." He stepped closer, close enough that Silas could smell the expensive cologne the man wore, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly wages. "But I see what you really are. You're a man who took an opportunity, who saw a savage woman that nobody else wanted and decided to make her your property by wrapping it up in pretty words about choice and respect." Nahimana's posture changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in her weight, a slight adjustment in how she held her shoulders. Anyone who knew her would recognize it as the movement a predator makes right before it strikes. And suddenly, the real question wasn't what Silas would do. It was what Nahimana would allow to happen before she ended this herself. Nahimana had been silent through the entire exchange, standing beside Silas with the patience of someone who had survived far worse insults than anything Cornelius Blackwell could deliver. But there was a difference between patience and submission, and anyone who mistook one for the other was about to learn a very expensive lesson. She stepped forward, not aggressively, not with any obvious threat. She simply moved into the space between Silas and Blackwell, with the kind of confidence that made grown men reconsider their choices. Up close, the difference in physical presence became even more apparent. Blackwell was a tall man by most standards, but Nahimana stood eye to eye with him, and where he had the soft build of someone who had never missed a meal or worked a hard day, she had the lean muscle of a warrior who had been training since childhood. "You called me a savage," she said. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried across the street in a way that made everyone lean in to hear. "Twice now. Once when you arrived, and again just now." Blackwell opened his mouth to respond, but Nahimana continued as if he had not tried to speak at all. "In my language, there is no word that translates exactly to savage. The closest we have means something like one who has not yet learned the proper way to be human. We use it for children who are still learning, for outsiders who do not yet understand our customs, for people who act without wisdom or respect." She tilted her head slightly, studying Blackwell the way someone might examine an interesting but ultimately disappointing specimen. "By that definition, you are the savage here, not me." The crowd had grown larger still. Word was spreading through town that something significant was happening on the main street, and people were abandoning their daily tasks to witness it. A few of the older townspeople looked uncomfortable, as if they knew this situation was spiraling into territory that might have lasting consequences. Blackwell's face had progressed beyond purple towards something closer to crimson. His jaw worked as if he was chewing on words too angry to release properly. One of his men put a hand on his shoulder, clearly trying to suggest they should leave, but Blackwell shrugged it off violently. "I don't need to stand here and be lectured by some woman who should be grateful any civilized man would even look at her," Blackwell snarled. "You want to know the truth? I didn't come here to make a genuine offer. I came here to prove a point, to show everyone in this pathetic little town that everything and everyone has a price, that all your high-minded talk about respect and choice is just poverty disguised as virtue." He gestured broadly at the crowd, his voice rising. "Any one of you would take this money if I offered it for the right thing. Your land, your horses, your dignity, all of it for sale if the price is high enough. That's what civilization is. Understanding that everything is a transaction." Nahimana smiled then, not a friendly smile, not even an amused smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they have just realized their opponent has revealed a fatal weakness. "You are right about one thing," she said. "This is a transaction, but not the kind you think." She reached down to her belt and slowly, deliberately, pulled something free. A knife, not a decorative piece, not something meant for show. This was a working blade, the kind used for hunting, for survival, for protection when necessary. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by years of use. The blade itself was perhaps 8 inches long, perfectly maintained, sharp enough to catch the light in a way that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. Nahimana held the knife loosely in her right hand, not in a threatening position, but in a way that suggested she knew exactly how to use it if circumstances required. Blackwell's eyes went wide, and both of his men immediately reached for weapons concealed under their coats. But Nahimana was not looking at them. She was looking at Silas, and there was a question in her eyes, a question that asked whether he trusted her, whether he understood what she was about to do, whether he would stand with her or try to stop her. Silas met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. Whatever came next, they were in it together. Nahimana turned her attention back to Blackwell, who had gone very still, very quickly. His bravado from moments before had evaporated the instant he realized he might actually be in physical danger. His men had their hands on their weapons, but had not drawn them, clearly uncertain whether drawing on an Apache woman in the middle of a crowded street was a situation they wanted to be involved in. "You want to buy something from me?" Nahimana asked. "Then let me make you a counteroffer." Nahimana held the knife in a way that suggested she had held it 1,000 times before, not like someone trying to intimidate, like someone who understood that a tool was only as useful as the person wielding it, and she was extremely useful when circumstances required. "You say everything has a price," Nahimana said to Blackwell, "that all things can be bought and sold. So let me offer you a trade." She gestured to the bag of money still clutched in Blackwell's white-knuckled grip. "Keep your $10,000. I do not want it. I do not need it. What I want from you is something far more valuable, something you clearly have never given to anyone in your entire life." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth remembering. Blackwell tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes kept flickering to the knife, to Nahimana's steady hand, to his own men who seemed increasingly uncertain about their employer's choices. "I want your respect," Nahimana said simply. "Not your money, not your approval. Your genuine respect for me as a person who has as much right to exist in this world as you do, who has as much value, who makes her own choices about her own life." She took a single step closer to Blackwell, who involuntarily took a step back. His heel caught on the edge of the wooden sidewalk, and he stumbled slightly, catching himself, but losing even more dignity in the process. "But you cannot give me that, can you?" Nahimana continued, "because you have never respected anyone in your life. Not your workers, not the people in this town, not even yourself. You measure everything in money because that is the only language you speak, the only value you understand." She turned the knife slowly in her hand, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. "My father gave me this knife when I completed my first solo hunt. I was 13 years old. It took me 3 days to track a deer through terrain that would have killed most grown men. When I returned with the meat, my father did not praise me. He did not tell me I had done well. He simply handed me this knife and said it was now mine to keep." Nahimana looked back at Blackwell, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something other than anger or contempt in her expression. There was genuine curiosity, as if she was trying to understand how a person could live so long and learn so little. That knife was worth maybe $2 in trade value, but it meant more to me than anything else I owned, because it represented something I had earned through effort and skill. Something given to me by someone I respected, who respected me in return. She held the knife out toward Blackwell, handle first, offering it to him. "I will trade you this knife for your bag of money," she said. "Not because I want your money, but to prove a point, to show everyone here what the difference is between value and price, between something earned and something bought." Blackwell stared at the offered knife as if it might bite him. His mind was clearly working through the trap he sensed but could not quite identify. If he took the trade, he would be admitting that a $2 knife was worth $10,000, making him look foolish. If he refused the trade, he would be admitting that not everything could be bought, contradicting his entire worldview. "This is absurd," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "You expect me to trade $10,000 for a knife?" "No," Nahimana said calmly. "I expect you to understand that you cannot trade $10,000 for this knife, because this knife is not for sale. Just like I am not for sale. Just like the respect and love between me and my husband is not for sale. Some things exist outside your world of transactions and purchases." She lowered the knife and returned it to her belt in one smooth motion. "You came here to prove that everything has a price. Instead, you have proven that you cannot recognize value when it stands directly in front of you, that you are so trapped in your own small understanding of the world that you cannot see beyond money to the things that actually matter." The crowd was completely silent. Several people were nodding slowly, as if pieces were falling into place in their minds. Even Blackwell's own men were looking at their employer with expressions that suggested they were reassessing their employment choices. Blackwell's face had gone through so many color changes that he now looked almost pale. His hand shook slightly as he held the money bag, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "You think you have won something here," he said quietly. "You think you have made me look foolish, but I will remember this, both of you, and there are consequences for embarrassing men like me." That was when the sheriff stepped forward from the crowd. Sheriff Warren Hayes was a man who had seen enough conflict in his years to recognize when a situation was about to cross from words into violence. He moved through the crowd with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that rushing would only escalate tension, but delay might allow things to spiral beyond control. He was older than most people in town, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions. He had been sheriff for almost 20 years, and in that time he had learned that the law was less about absolute right and wrong than about keeping people from killing each other over disputes that would seem trivial a week later. But he had also learned that some disputes were not trivial at all. Some were about fundamental questions of human dignity that would define what kind of town this was going to be. "Mr. Blackwell," Hayes said, his tone neutral and professional, "I think it might be time for you to move along. You have made your offer. It has been declined. Continuing this conversation serves no purpose." Blackwell turned to face the sheriff with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. The fear and uncertainty that had crossed his face during Nahimana's response vanished, replaced by the confident smirk of a man who believed he held all the real power in any room he entered. "Sheriff," Blackwell said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting by chance, "I am glad you are here. I was hoping to speak with you about a business matter. You see, I am considering purchasing some property in this area. Significant property. The kind of investment that would bring jobs and money to your town." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Blackwell was offering a bribe without actually saying the words. He was suggesting that his continued business interest in the town depended on how this situation was resolved. That if the sheriff sided with Silas and Nahimana, there would be economic consequences for the entire community. Hayes had dealt with men like Blackwell before. Men who believed their wealth gave them the right to operate outside the boundaries that governed ordinary people. Men who saw the law as something that could be bought or negotiated, rather than something that applied equally to everyone. "The property market is not my concern," Hayes said evenly. "Keeping the peace is, and right now you are disturbing that peace." Blackwell's smile tightened. "I made a legitimate business offer. If it offended anyone, I apologize. But surely there is no law against making an offer, even if others find it distasteful. You made an insulting proposition to a married woman in public," Hayes said. "That goes beyond distasteful. That is harassment. And if you continue, I will have grounds to arrest you for disturbing the peace and public nuisance." The crowd reacted with surprised murmurs. Few people expected the sheriff to side so clearly with Silas and Nahimana, especially against a man who had just implied he might bring significant wealth to the town. Several of the business owners in the crowd looked conflicted, clearly torn between their moral discomfort with Blackwell's behavior and their economic interest in his potential investments. Blackwell's face hardened. The mask of friendly businessman fell away completely, revealing something much colder underneath. "You are making a serious mistake, Sheriff," he said quietly. "I have friends in territorial government. I have business relationships with people who can make your life very difficult. Are you really willing to throw away your career to defend these two?" Hayes did not flinch. He had been threatened before by men who thought power meant the ability to hurt others without consequence. "My career is not your concern," Hayes said. "And yes, I am willing to defend any person in my town who is being publicly harassed and threatened. That is what the law requires, what my oath requires." He turned slightly to address Blackwell's two men, who still had their hands near their concealed weapons. "If either of you gentlemen draws a weapon in my town, I will consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly. I suggest you keep your hands visible and away from those coats." The two men exchanged glances, then slowly moved their hands away from their weapons. Whatever Blackwell was paying them, it clearly was not enough to get into a gunfight with a sheriff in the middle of a crowded street. Blackwell stood very still for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was physically chewing on the words he wanted to say, but knew better than to release. Finally, he turned his attention back to Silas and Nahimana, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with barely controlled rage. "This is not over," he said. "Not even close." He turned and walked back toward his carriage, his two men following behind him like shadows. The crowd parted to let them through, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might actually be resolved without further incident. But then Blackwell stopped halfway to his carriage and turned back one final time. "You should know something," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I did not come to this town by accident." The words hung in the air like a noose waiting to tighten. Blackwell stood with his back to his carriage, that smug expression returning to his face as he watched the confusion spread through the crowd. He had been waiting for this moment, saving it like a card player holds back his best hand until exactly the right time to play it. Silas felt Nahimana tense beside him, not with fear, with recognition. She knew something about what Blackwell was about to say, or at least suspected, and whatever it was made her more guarded than she had been even when holding her knife moments before. 3 months ago, Blackwell began, addressing the crowd as much as Silas and Nahimana, I received a very interesting letter from a business associate in Denver. This associate deals in land acquisitions, property development, the kind of work that requires knowing about opportunities before they become public knowledge. He told me about a ranch here, small operation, modest but well-maintained. Nothing special about it except for one detail. He paused for effect, clearly enjoying the attention. The land it sits on has water rights that make it extraordinarily valuable. There is a spring on that property that feeds into the main water source for 3 neighboring ranches. Whoever controls that spring controls the water supply for a significant portion of grazing land in this area. My associate estimated the property could be worth 50 times what the current owners paid for it. If sold to the right buyer. Silas felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly which ranch Blackwell was describing. His ranch. The land he and Nahimana had purchased 3 years ago, with every dollar they had managed to save. They had known about the spring, of course, but they had bought the land to build a life, not to speculate on water rights. I came here to make an offer on that property, Blackwell continued. A very generous offer. More money than most ranchers see in 10 lifetimes. But when I asked around town about the owners, I heard the most fascinating story. About a rancher who had married an Apache woman. About how people in town did not quite know what to make of them. About how they kept to themselves mostly, but when they did come to town, heads turned. He gestured toward Nahimana with an expression that made Silas want to hit him regardless of consequences. I realized this was an opportunity for more than just a land deal. This was a chance to demonstrate something important. To show that no matter how much these people pretend to have dignity and principles, everyone has a price. The land, the woman, the respect. All of it can be bought if you offer enough. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward again, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. You need to leave now, Hayes said. Before this goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go. But Blackwell was not finished. He was the kind of man who needed to have the last word, who needed to make sure everyone understood exactly how clever he thought he was. The offer for the land still stands, he said, looking directly at Silas. $50,000. More money than you will ever see again. You can take it and buy property somewhere else. Somewhere people will not stare at you and your wife every time you walk down the street. Somewhere you can start over without all the judgment and whispers. He smiled then, and it was perhaps the cruelest expression Silas had seen on a human face. Or you can keep your pride and your principles and watch as I buy up every property around yours, as I control the water access for your neighbors, as I make sure that every person in this area knows that the reason their ranches are struggling is because you refuse to sell, because you put your own stubborn pride above the welfare of your community. The threat was clear and brutal. Blackwell was not just trying to buy the land. He was trying to isolate them, to turn their neighbors against them, to make their continued presence so costly to everyone around them that they would have no choice but to leave. Nahimana's hand moved to her belt again, not to the knife but to something else. A small leather cord that Silas recognized as connected to a medicine pouch she wore under her shirt. It was a gesture she made when she was thinking deeply about something, weighing options that had no good outcomes. Silas looked at the faces in the crowd. Some showed sympathy, some showed concern, but others showed something more complicated. They showed calculation. They were doing the math in their heads, wondering if $50,000 was worth standing against, wondering if supporting Silas and Nahimana was worth potentially losing their own water access. You have made your offer, Silas said quietly, and our answer is no. The land is not for sale, not for $50,000, not for any amount. Blackwell's smile widened. Then I suppose we will see how long you can hold on to principles when reality starts to bite. He climbed into his carriage without another word. His 2 men followed, and within moments the expensive vehicle was rolling away down the street, leaving a cloud of dust and a town full of people who were suddenly looking at Silas and Nahimana very differently than they had an hour before. The sheriff remained standing nearby, his expression troubled. The crowd dispersed slowly, people breaking into small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed. Silas could hear fragments of conversation as people passed, and what he heard made his chest tighten with a different kind of tension than anything Blackwell had created. $50,000 is more money than this whole town sees in a year. If he buys up the surrounding land, we could lose access to water. My cattle would have nowhere to graze. I got nothing against them personally, but is their pride worth everyone else suffering? Sheriff Hayes waited until most of the crowd had moved on before speaking. His voice was low, meant only for Silas and Nahimana to hear. That was well handled, he said. Both of you kept your composure when most people would have lost theirs. But I need you to understand something. Blackwell is not just making threats. Men like him have resources and connections that can make life very difficult. If he starts buying up land around yours, he can legally restrict access in ways that will hurt your neighbors. And when that happens, They will blame you, whether that is fair or not. Silas knew Hayes was right. The sheriff was not trying to pressure them into selling. He was simply stating the reality of their situation. We built that ranch from nothing, Silas said. Every fence post, every building. We cleared rocks from fields until our hands bled. That land is not just property to us. It is proof that we can make a life together despite everyone who said it was impossible. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I know, and I respect that. But respect will not protect you if your neighbors decide you are the reason their livelihoods are threatened. Nahimana had been silent through this exchange, her expression distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice had a quality that Silas recognized as the tone she used when discussing her past, her life before they met. When I left my tribe to marry Silas, she said, my mother told me something. She said that living between two worlds means never fully belonging to either, that I would always be too Apache for the settlers and too influenced by settlers for my own people. She said the price of that choice would be loneliness, and I needed to decide if love was worth that cost. She looked at Silas with an expression that held years of shared struggles and small victories. I told her it was, and I have never regretted that choice, not once, not even now. The three of them stood in the now empty street, the sun having moved enough that shadows were starting to lengthen from the buildings. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, but the heat of the situation they faced was only intensifying. What will you do? Hayes asked. We will go home, Silas said. We will take care of our animals. We will maintain our land, and we will wait to see what Blackwell does next, because giving in to threats is not an option, not for us. Hayes looked like he wanted to say more, to offer advice or warnings, but he seemed to recognize that some decisions were already made, and no amount of practical wisdom would change them. He simply nodded and walked back toward his office, leaving Silas and Nahimana alone on the street. They gathered their supplies from the general store, neither speaking as they loaded everything onto their wagon. The shopkeeper had been apologetic, almost embarrassed, as he helped them, clearly uncomfortable with the position they were now in, but not brave enough to say anything supportive in case it hurt his business. As they prepared to leave town, a man approached them. He was older, probably in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors. Silas recognized him as Calvin Briggs, who owned a ranch about 5 miles from theirs. I need to speak with you, Briggs said without preamble. His tone was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. About this water situation. Nahimana looked at the man with the same steady gaze she had given Blackwell, though without the anger. She was simply assessing, trying to determine whether he was a threat or simply someone caught in an impossible situation. We did not create this problem, Silas said carefully. Blackwell did. We are just trying to live our lives. I understand that, Briggs said. But understanding does not change the fact that my livelihood depends on water access that apparently flows through your land. If Blackwell starts buying up property and restricting usage, my ranch dies. My family loses everything. And while I got no personal issue with you two, I need to know if you have considered what your refusal to sell might cost the rest of us. The question hung between them, heavy with implications, because that was the real cruelty of what Blackwell had done. He had not just threatened Silas and Nahimana, he had turned them into a problem for everyone else, had made their neighbors view them not as fellow ranchers, but as obstacles to survival. We have considered it, Nahimana said quietly, and we have decided that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. Briggs looked at them for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. I hope you are right about that, because if you are wrong, a lot of innocent people are going to pay the price. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving them with the crushing weight of knowing that this fight was no longer just about their own dignity. It was about to become something much larger. 3 days after the confrontation with Blackwell, Silas and Nahimana rode back into town, but this time they were not alone. Calvin Briggs rode beside them, along with 4 other ranchers whose properties bordered theirs or depended on the same water sources. They had spent those 3 days visiting every neighbor, having difficult conversations, and proposing something that had never been done in that area before. They gathered in the church at the edge of town, the only building large enough to hold everyone who needed to be part of this discussion. Sheriff Hayes was there, so were most of the business owners. Even some people who had no direct stake in the water rights came. sensing that what happened today would define the character of their community for years to come. Silas stood at the front of the room, Nahimana beside him. He held a stack of papers that had taken him 2 days to write and 1 day to have reviewed by the one lawyer in town who was willing to help them. "We have spent the last 3 days talking to our neighbors," Silas began, "listening to their concerns, understanding that our decision affects more than just us, and we have come up with a solution." He held up the papers so everyone could see. "These are water rights agreements, legal documents that grant permanent, irrevocable access to the spring on our property, to every rancher whose land borders ours or depends on that water source, free of charge, no conditions, no fees. The water that flows through our land will be shared equally with everyone who needs it." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Calvin Briggs stood up from his seat. "We have already signed," Briggs said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Silas and Nahimana brought these agreements to each of us. They sat in our homes and listened to our fears about what Blackwell might do. And then they offered us something that solved the entire problem. Not for money, not for favors, just because it was the right thing to do." Nahimana stepped forward, and the room quieted immediately. She had that effect on people. When she spoke, you listened. "In my tribe, water belongs to everyone," she said. "It is not something that can be owned by one person or sold for profit. It flows where it flows, and those who need it share it. When Silas and I bought this land, we never intended to control the water. We just wanted a place to build our life. So this agreement simply puts into legal terms what we already believed. That water is for everyone who needs it." The implications were sinking in now. If the water rights were already distributed to all the neighboring ranches through legal agreements, then Blackwell had nothing to leverage. He could buy surrounding properties, but he could not control the water. The strategic value he had been counting on had just evaporated. Someone in the back of the room started clapping, then another person joined. Within moments, the entire room was applauding, not just for the practical solution, but for what it represented. A refusal to let outside pressure destroy their community. A choice to solve problems together rather than let fear divide them. The church doors opened, and Cornelius Blackwell walked in. He had clearly heard about the meeting and come to see what was happening. His expensive suit looked out of place among the working clothes of the ranchers, and his expression suggested he already understood what had occurred. "Very clever," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You have given away the one thing that made your property valuable, destroyed your own leverage." "We did not give anything away," Silas said calmly. "We shared something that was never ours alone to begin with." Blackwell looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. There was no fear there anymore, no uncertainty, just a quiet confidence that came from people who had solved their problem without him. "You have made a mistake," Blackwell said. "All of you. I could still buy this entire area. Make your lives difficult in ways you cannot imagine." Sheriff Hayes stood up from his seat near the back. "Or you could leave," Hayes said, "because you have lost. Not just the water rights, not just the business opportunity. You have lost any chance of being welcome in this town. We do not need your money or your threats. We take care of our own." Blackwell stood there for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was physically trying to chew through his rage. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. His footsteps echoed in the silent church until the doors closed behind him. The tension that had gripped the room for days finally broke. People stood and shook hands with Silas and Nahimana, offering congratulations and apologies for ever doubting them. Calvin Briggs pulled Silas into a rough embrace that spoke of respect earned through action rather than words. Nahimana caught Silas's eye across the crowd, and he saw in her expression the same thing he felt. They had not just saved their ranch, they had proven that dignity and principle could stand against wealth and power, that a community united was stronger than any individual threat. That love and respect were worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. The ranch was still theirs. The water would flow freely, and somewhere down that dusty road, a man in an expensive suit was learning that not everything could be bought. Some lessons cost more than money, and some values were worth more than any price. If you enjoyed this story of dignity and courage in the Old West, click the video on your screen right now to watch another tale of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges in the untamed frontier. Stories where character matters more than wealth, and where standing up for what is right changes everything. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss these powerful Western narratives that remind us what true strength really means. Hit that button now, because the next story is waiting, and it is one you will not want to miss.